This is part 3 of Ephesians 5:25 to 31. And I want to think about the model of Christ's love for the church in its relationship to a husband's love to their wives, and whether this model is peculiar to the husband-wife relationship or more general for how we treat all Christians. And if that's the case, is there anything in this entire unit that says the way a husband is to love his wife is unique among all relationships? Let's read it. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it may sound like a strange question to you. Why would I ask about whether this is unique to marriage? And it's because it's not on the face of it. Here's John 15:12. This is my commandment, that you, my disciples, love one another as I have loved you. So there you have, Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So that's Jesus loving his disciples. And it's made the model for all disciples, not just husbands towards wives. Or here's again, back in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. Walk in love. All of you Christians, walk in love as Christ loved us, all Christians, and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So Christ loved us, all of us, the church. And so all of us walk in love toward one another. It's the model for everybody's love toward every Christian. So back in chapter 5, verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church is a specific example of human Christians loving a particular other Christian the way we're all supposed to love each other. Now pause right there and say, well, what would you respond if a person said, well, that's not very special to call a husband to love a wife just the way he's supposed to love every woman, every man? I think Paul would say, can I turn that around and just make a comment? What I'm saying is, Paul says, that a husband dare not set his standard of love toward his wife lower than the highest standard in the universe. Like, it doesn't get any higher than love like Christ loved the church and gave himself. This is the highest standard for how you treat somebody that can possibly be conceived. And he's saying, don't ever fall short of it, husbands, in this woman. It would be crazy to him, I think, to say, oh, there's nothing special in that. I just have to treat her with the infinite standard of Christ's love. I don't think Paul would compute with that objection. He nourishes and cherishes it. That's the picture. And then to support it in the most mysterious and beautiful way, Paul goes back and quotes Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So this one flesh is the ground for this statement, husbands, love your wives as your own body, because God, in a way that nobody can fathom, nobody can plumb the bottom of this mystery, God in marriage has ordained to unite bodies as one flesh. Noelle, my wife, is my body in a way that no other woman and no other man is. And she is such till one of us dies. Don't rend asunder what God has united. That's not a small thing. This one flesh here is a miracle wrought by God in the books of heaven and in the mystery of femaleness and maleness in marriage, and can't be reduced to any one physical or psychological thing. And so I wind up saying, okay, Christ loved the church is a model for all Christians, loving all Christians, but don't lose sight, it's a model that is infinite. You can't set a higher model or goal of love than Christ gave himself in his infinite worth for an unworthy, sinful, rebellious church. You can't. And so, husbands, make sure you set the highest possible love standard for loving this woman, because that body and her body are one flesh, so that when you nourish yourself or when you nourish her and cherish her, you are nourishing and cherishing yourself in a most profound, mysterious, and wonderful way.
That there is no more important theme for the Church of Jesus Christ today than this theme of husbands and fathers. Dr. James Dobson is probably known by name to a good many of you, who is probably the foremost interpreter of family life in the United States today, who has a radio program on something like 400 stations, wrote to me a little while back and asked permission to quote something that I had said, and I very gladly gave him that permission. What I said was, the number one problem of the United States today is renegade males. I wouldn't necessarily say the same is true in other nations, but I'm inclined to think it is. Males who've reneged on their two primary responsibilities as husbands and fathers. I'm going to talk now about husbands, but in order to talk about husbands, I have to lay a foundation by talking about marriage, because it's only through marriage that a man becomes a husband. And unless we understand the basic biblical picture of marriage, a man cannot take his place as a husband. So I want to lay certain foundation truths concerning marriage. First of all, and most important, marriage is a covenant. There are two main passages in the Bible which teach this. A covenant is the most solemn and binding form of commitment that the Bible knows. And it's a principle in the Bible that no lasting relationship can be built without a covenant. The relationship of the believer to God is based on a covenant. The relationship of believers to one another is based on a covenant. And the relationship of husband to wife is based on a covenant. And those are the three most important permanent relationships open to human beings. In each of them, the covenant is basic. Proverbs chapter 2, verse 16, the theme is that if you listen to this teaching, it will deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. So that the woman who's unfaithful to her husband is forgetting, breaking the covenant that she made before God with that man. So even in the Old Testament, marriage is a covenant between a man and a woman made in the presence of God. And then right at the end of the Old Testament, the last book, the prophet Malachi, God is challenging and charging Israel with their failures and their delinquencies, in spite of the fact that they are a very religious people. And this is what the Lord says to them in Malachi chapter 2. And they're complaining that God doesn't answer their prayers. They say, we're praying all the time, we're always in the temple, and God, you don't answer our prayers. And God says, I'll tell you one or two reasons why I don't answer your prayers. And here's one of them. Malachi 2:13. This is the second thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and crying. So he does not regard the offering anymore, nor receive it with goodwill from your hands. He says, you can bring all the sacrifices you like, but I'm not going to receive them. You can cry and weep before me, but I'm not going to answer your prayers. Now, why does he say that? Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously. Yet she is your companion and your wife by covenant. So God says to men who profess religion, doesn't matter how much you pray, how often you come to church, if you are not faithful to your covenant commitment to your wife, I won't listen to your prayers. I will not pay any attention to you. And he declares that such men are covenant breakers. So you see, both for the woman and for the man, unfaithfulness to the marriage commitment is the breaking of a covenant. That's why adultery is so much more serious a sin than fornication. Fornication, not known in the Bible as premarital sex, fornication is immorality between two persons who are not married. It's immorality, it's sin, but it's not the breaking of a covenant. But adultery is immorality which involves the breaking of a covenant. And that's why adultery is far more serious than fornication. Now, covenant is one of God's secrets. In Psalm 25 and verse 14, the Lord talks about his covenant and the kind of people that he will reveal his covenant to. No one can understand covenant in the biblical sense except by revelation. Only God can make us understand from the scriptures what covenant is. But in Psalm 25, verse 14, the psalmist says, the secret of the Lord is with those who fear him, and he will show them his covenant. So God's covenant is his secret, but he reveals it to whom? To those who fear him. It's the God-fearing that can apprehend and enter into covenant. Well, you know the story. Right at the last moment, when Abraham had his hand upraised to plunge the knife into the body of his son, the Lord spoke to him and said, all right, Abraham, you don't need to do it. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. That's covenant. But that's not the end of the story. Because about 2,000 years later, what happened? The Lord said, you and your descendants need a sacrifice. There's only one person who can make that sacrifice. It's my son. You offered your son to me. Now I'm offering my son for you. And viewed in that light, you see, history is the outworking of God's covenants with his people. You cannot overemphasize the importance of covenant. Covenant is entered into through sacrifice, which is the laying down of a life. Now, apply this to marriage. When a man and a woman get married as Christians, they come through Jesus on the cross. Each one of them says, as Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. So after they have passed through the sacrifice of Jesus, each one turns back and looks at that sacrifice. And the husband says, when I came through that sacrifice, I died. I laid down my life. Now I live out my life in my mate. She's the expression of my life. And the wife does the same. When I passed through that sacrifice, I died. I no longer live for myself. I'm living for the one with whom I am in covenant. Each laid down his life or her life for the other. That's the basis of Christian marriage. And that's the only basis on which marriage can truly succeed, you see? It's totally contrary to the attitude of people today. That's why so many marriages break up, because most people today go into the marriage with the attitude, what will I get out of this? And it doesn't work. The biblical attitude is, what will I give? And that works. When a man and a woman get married as Christians, they come through Jesus on the cross. Each one of them says, as Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. So after they have passed through the sacrifice of Jesus, each one turns back and looks at that sacrifice. The husband says, when I came through that sacrifice, I died. I laid down my life. Now I live out my life in my mate. She's the expression of my life. And the wife does the same. When I passed through that sacrifice, I died. I no longer live for myself. I'm living for the one with whom I am in covenant. Each laid down his life or her life for the other. That's the basis of Christian marriage. And that's the only basis on which marriage can truly succeed, you see? It's totally contrary to the attitude of people today. That's why so many marriages break up, because most people today go into the marriage with the attitude, what will I get out of this? And it doesn't work. The biblical attitude is, what will I give? And that works. In practice, it works. You look at the people that don't approach marriage that way, and what you look at is a series of disasters. No generation in human history has ever had so many unhappy, broken marriages and homes as our generation. And the reason is the wrong approach. What can I get rather than what can I give? You know what Jesus said? It is more blessed to what? To give than to receive. That's true in marriage. The one who gives is the one who's fully blessed. Now, I should probably pause and say, I'm certainly not an expert, but I have a good track record. I was married to my first wife, who's now with the Lord, for 30 years. And we together raised a family of 9 daughters, adopted daughters. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was happy, it was successful, and it was fruitful. And it was subjected to tremendous pressures. In the first 2 years, we lived through the fighting that brought the state of Israel into being. Twice in that period, we had to flee from our house in the middle of the night to save our lives. It was not an easy way to begin a wedding, a marriage. But we were together, and God used us, and we served Him, and God made us a blessing to many, many people. And then, after my first wife was taken home, 3 years later, I married my present wife, Ruth, whom you've seen here tonight. And we have now been married for just over 10 years, and our marriage has been outstandingly happy and successful. And through our marriage, God has birthed a ministry which is actually now reaching most of the earth with the Word of God. So, at least I'm not offering you a theory when I talk about marriage, you understand? In practice, it works. You look at the people that don't approach marriage that way, and what you look at is a series of disasters. No generation in human history has ever had so many unhappy, broken marriages and homes as our generation. And the reason is the wrong approach. What can I get rather than what can I give? You know what Jesus said? It is more blessed to what? To give than to receive. That's true in marriage. The one who gives is the one who's fully blessed. All right, now, what's the end purpose of God in marriage? Turning to Genesis 2, verse 24, let me point out to you that marriage was originated in the mind of God. Adam didn't think up marriage. He didn't even know about marriage. He didn't even know he needed a wife. The whole thing was planned by God. All the rules for it were laid down by God. And the end purpose of it was established by God. Marriage, according to the Bible, is totally divine in its origin. It's not a human social contract. It's a divine ordinance. And the purpose in it is unity. And again, we come to the same biblical fact. If you study the Bible, there's only one basis for unity between men and women, and it is covenant. Without covenant, there is no real enduring unity. And so this is what God said about marriage in Genesis 2:24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The purpose is unity. Key to marriage is the two words, leave and cleave. And if you don't leave, you cannot cleave. If you're not willing to step out of your parental background and make a totally new start, that marriage won't work. Millions of marriages are spoiled by mothers-in-law and parents that want to control the couple and keep them under their thumb. And it never works. Parents, don't you meddle with your children's marriages, all right? Because you won't help. It may not be going well, but you'll make it worse. It's leave and then cleave. In many, many cultures, the real reason for homes that are not successful and marriages that don't really work is that the culture teaches that the man usually shall cleave to his father and mother. And there's a loyalty that stands between him and being loyal to his wife. I want to point out to you that marriage is not a matter of social customs or culture. There are lots of things that are, and the Bible makes room for them. But all the teaching about marriage and home in the Bible is based on two things: the eternal relationships in the Godhead between the Father and the Son, and the purpose of God in creation. And those never change. It doesn't matter what the culture is, what the nationality is, what the language is. God's purpose there does not change. You see, a lot of people have got the idea today that marriage is an experiment. That's totally wrong. It's a commitment. And you can't make an experiment of commitment, you understand? And when you make a commitment, the commitment you make releases the grace that you need. But if you don't make the commitment, you can't claim the grace. It's faith. But without faith, what? It's impossible to please God. See, there's no other basis but faith. It's a risk. Getting married is a real risk. I'll be honest with you. Don't prepare to take a risk, you better stay unmarried. It's a faith risk. I'd like to say something else. This is not a rule for everybody, but never have I chosen my own wife. In each of my marriages, God showed me clearly, specifically, and supernaturally whom I was to marry. And I'm glad He did, because God knows I'm not a very good judge of character. I deal well in the abstract and the concepts, but when it comes to people, I'm easily fooled. But God didn't give me the opportunity to be fooled. He made the decision for me. I'll tell you something else which is purely personal. I've never been anywhere but Jerusalem for a wife. All right, now, let's consider what's implied in what I've been teaching. What I want to say, in essence, is this. The husband's success is seen in his wife. The wife's success is seen in her husband. I heard about an experienced minister once who was asked about a certain Christian. Is he a good Christian? And he replied, I don't know, I can't tell you yet, I haven't met his wife. That's a very wise answer. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man, or the wife is the glory of the husband. You have to understand, in Greek, in Hebrew, in German, and various other languages, the same word means man and husband, and woman and wife. So you have to decide in English which is the appropriate translation, but it includes both. So the wife is the husband's glory. If you want to know, and this is a very searching statement, if you want to know whether I'm a successful husband, don't look at me, look at my wife. That's how you'll find out just how successful I am as a husband. And let me suggest to you one key word that a husband should produce in his wife is security. There are multitudes of insecure women today because there are multitudes of husbands that are not doing their job. Then look at the picture of the really successful woman by Bible standards in Proverbs 31. You know that, the last half of the last chapter of Proverbs. She's not the president of a corporation. She's an extremely successful wife and mother. And let me say, I think it takes much more guts and character to be a successful wife and mother than it does to be the president of the largest corporation. It's a much harder job. If you look, we're not going to read this all, but it says, who can find a virtuous woman? That's not a very good translation. In Hebrew, Eshet Chayil. Chayil means strength, success, power. Who can find a really successful woman? That's what it is. And then the writer of Proverbs says, her price is far above rubies. Her price is far above rubies. I didn't hear you. All right. All right. Just want to point out that in this picture of the successful woman, it begins, it centers in, and it concludes with the husband. What's the evidence of her success? Primarily, her husband. Look at verse 11. The heart of her husband safely trusts her. Verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. That's the position of honor, of distinction, of dignity, of success. But he's there because he's her husband. It's what she has contributed to him that causes him to be in that position. And then right at the end, verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Now let me say to you, husbands, and to myself, it pays to praise your wife. Believe me. Many of you would be surprised how much a wife longs for praise. You can't really pay her for what she does. There's no way that you could pay a wife, a good wife. But you give her praise. I mean that sincerely. And I say that to myself because I tend to take people for granted. I mean, I'm interested in results, and so people are there, and if we get the results, praise God. But God has been teaching me, don't take the people for granted.